The church stood at the edge of town like an old sentinel, its stone walls darkened by years of rain and soot, the tall spire piercing the gray evening sky. The air around it always seemed colder than the rest of Black Hollow, a damp chill that clung to skin and crept into bones. On most days, the bells rang softly at dawn and dusk, but now they sat silent. The iron gates were chained shut, and the windows, once glowing with warm candlelight, were black. Inside, the air was thick, still carrying the faint scent of incense, and something sharper, something metallic that didn't belong. That it was mid-October, and the town was preparing for the Harvest Festival, though the mood was quieter this year. The stalls on Main Street were half full, and the laughter of children seemed muted, as if the whole town was holding its breath. The priest's small stone cottage, just beyond the churchyard, had curtains drawn tight. From the outside, it looked empty, but the locals knew better. They had seen him in the days before, walking slowly, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting toward the shadows like a man who could hear something the rest of them couldn't. Father Elias Morgan had been in Black Hollow for 12 years. To many, he was a calm, steady figure, someone who listened more than he spoke. His sermons were never fire and brimstone, never meant to frighten. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen, as though he carried their troubles alongside his own. But those closest to him noticed that, over the past few weeks, his once firm voice had begun to waver, and the light in his eyes had dimmed. There were moments, mid-conversation, when he seemed to drift, staring past the person in front of him, as if he was listening to something else entirely. In the weeks before it happened, he had visited certain families quietly, without his collar, carrying no Bible. He stayed for only a few minutes each time. Some thought he was checking on the sick or the elderly, but others whispered about the way he left, walking quickly, avoiding eye contact like he wanted to be unseen. The people he visited didn't talk about it, not even to their neighbors. The cottage itself was small and spare, its furniture old but well kept. There was only one personal touch, a desk against the far wall, cluttered with thick journals. Father Elias kept them locked in a drawer, and no one in town had ever read them, until the night they found the last entry. Life in Black Hollow was slow, almost predictable. The same faces gathered at the bakery each morning, gossiping over strong coffee. The farmers kept to their routines, watching the weather as closely as their crops. Children walked to school together, the sound of their chatter echoing down the narrow streets. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about the town, but Black Hollow had a way of keeping its stories buried. People didn't talk about certain things. The old well that had been sealed off decades ago, the sudden disappearance of the Barker family's youngest son, the night the church bells rang for hours without anyone pulling the rope. Father Elias had never spoken openly about the town's past. When asked, he would just smile faintly and change the subject. But there was a quiet tension in the way he sometimes glanced at the church's darkened corners or paused at certain pews as if aware of something others weren't. And then there were the small signs, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. The church's wooden doors, suddenly reinforced with new locks. The faint scratches on the stone threshold, like something had tried to get in or out. The strange sound when the altar boys swore he heard late one night. Something between a whisper and a sigh, coming from the walls themselves. Early October. Father Elias seemed more tired, more worn down. At Mass, he spoke softly, almost too softly to be heard in the back pews. His hands trembled when he lifted the chalice. Afterward, he lingered in the empty church, alone for hours, until the sun dipped and shadows filled the nave. When the crime finally came to light, people tried to piece together the days before it happened, but the truth was no one had really been watching. Everyone in Black Hollow was busy with their quiet troubles, and the priest's decline was easy to dismiss as simple exhaustion. Only later would they realize the signs had been there all along, small cracks in the world they thought was solid. In the end, all that remained of him was the diary. The last entry was dated October 14th. It was written in a tight, hurried hand, as if the pen had been shaking. There were no long passages, no explanations, no prayers. Just two words. It's back that it started with small changes. things most people wouldn't have noticed if they weren't looking closely. Father Elias began locking the church earlier than usual, sometimes as early as mid-afternoon, claiming he had errands in town. He no longer stayed after Mass to chat with the parishioners, slipping instead into the sacristy and disappearing through the side door. Even his sermons shifted in tone. He spoke less about hope, more about vigilance, about keeping watch when night comes, and being ready for what walks unseen. People thought it was just the season. The darker days of autumn could make anyone sound grim. But in private, he was different. Mrs. Caro, the church's longtime organist, said she caught him one evening in the nave, standing motionless in the dark, staring at the crucifix as though waiting for it to move. She called his name twice before he turned to her, startled, his face pale. "I thought I heard something," he said, though the air had been still and silent. Then came the locked confessional. It had never been locked in all the years Mrs. Caro had worked there, but suddenly it was, and Father Elias kept the key with him at all times. When one of the altar boys asked about it, he only said, "It's safer this way," and changed the subject. The first real spark of unease came during a late-night meeting of the parish council. They were gathered in the small side room off the nave, going over finances for the festival, when Father Elias abruptly cut off the discussion. He leaned forward and asked, "Has anyone seen the old well lately?" The room fell silent. The well was something people avoided mentioning, not because of any clear danger, but because of what it represented. Stories about a boy who fell in decades ago, the water that had turned black for weeks afterward. No one had gone near it in years. When no one answered, he pressed further. "If you go there, if you hear anything, don't answer it." His voice was low, almost urgent. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if he was joking or slipping into one of his more cryptic moods. Later, more than one of them admitted they'd felt something in the air that night, thick, heavy, as if the church walls themselves were listening. Outside pressures were weighing on the town, too. The harvest festival had been scaled down because of poor crops that year. Families were struggling. The carters, who supplied the bread for the church events, had barely enough to cover their bills. Rumors began to spread that the parish's money was running low as well. And yet, somehow, Father Elias found funds to order new ironwork for the church doors and to reinforce the shutters on the stained glass windows. Some started to resent him for it. "Why does the church need to be shut up like a prison?" Mr. Abbott asked one morning at the bakery. "We've never had trouble here." He spoke loud enough for others to hear, and by the end of the day, the whispers had started that maybe the priest was hiding something. Tension built in the smaller, private moments, too. Margaret Doyle, who cleaned the church twice a week, noticed new scratches on the inside of the vestry due, or deep grooves like something had clawed at it from the inside. When she asked Father Elias about them, he told her it was just old wood splintering. But the wood was solid oak, and she had worked in that church for 15 years. She knew those marks hadn't been there before one evening, just after sunset. A farmhand named Samuel Finch stopped by the rectory to drop off eggs. He swore he saw someone standing in the church doorway, a tall figure with its head slightly bent, watching him. He called out a greeting, but the figure didn't move. When he mentioned it to Father Elias later, the priest went still. "Was it me you saw?" Samuel shook his head. "No," he said. "This one was taller, broader." The priest didn't ask any more questions, but that night, he didn't turn on the rectory lights. He stayed inside, sitting in the dark with his journal open, writing page after page. By now, the diary was filling with more than scripture and sermon notes. The handwriting became erratic, as though written in haste. Certain words appeared over and over: watch, barrier, entry, and finally, breach. There were other signs, subtle, but stacking together like stones in a wall. One altar boy quit suddenly, refusing to go into the church after dark. Mrs. Caro said she began hearing faint humming when she was alone at the organ, a tune she didn't recognize. And late one night, a farmer passing by swore he saw a light moving behind the stained glass, like someone carrying a lantern, but the church had been locked for hours. Father Elias's relationships began to fray. His once steady friendship with Mrs. Caro became strained. She told a neighbor she felt like he was keeping something from her, and it hurt. After all the years they had shared, after all the trust. Even the children noticed his distance. He no longer laughed when they brought him small gifts from the fields, wildflowers, apples. Instead, he would just nod and thank them. His mind somewhere else, that'd be why the first week of October, his behavior was unsettling enough that people began to talk about calling the bishop. But before anyone could make the request, something happened that no one could explain. Two boys, brothers aged 8 and 10, wandered too close to the church one evening. They claimed they heard a knocking sound from beneath the floorboards. Not a random creak, but 3 sharp knocks, followed by silence. When they told their parents, the story spread quickly. Some laughed it off as the overactive imagination of children, but others remembered the old well and went quiet. Father Elias heard about it, the next day and went pale. He didn't speak for a long moment, then told the parents, if they hear it again, don't let them answer. The words sounded strange, out of place, as if they belonged to a conversation no one else had been part of. That night, the priest was seen walking alone toward the church just before midnight. No one knows how long he stayed inside, but when the baker passed by at dawn, the front doors were ajar, and a cold wind was pouring out into the street. The night it happened, the air was so still it felt unnatural, as if the town itself was waiting. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the streets were empty. Even the dogs had gone quiet. Inside the church, only one light burned. A single candle on the altar, its flames shivering in the draft that slipped through the cracks in the old stone. Father Elias had been there for hours. His coat hung over the back of a pew, his collar loosened. The diary lay open on the altar, the pages covered in cramped, uneven writing. His hands rested on either side of it, fingers tapping as if marking time. Outside, a soft sound began, a low hum, so faint it could have been the wind. But he froze, his breath catching. The hum grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside. It was rising from beneath the floor. A slow, steady rhythm, almost like chanting. Elias backed away from the altar, his eyes fixed on the cracks between the wooden boards. Then came the knock, 3 sharp, deliberate raps, just as the children had described. The candle guttered. The air turned colder. His voice was barely more than a whisper. No further. But even as he spoke, something answered, a deep, wet rasp, like a voice speaking through water. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it filled the space with meaning all the same. The doors of the far end of the nave creaked open. Elias spun, his pulse hammering. A figure stepped inside, moving slowly up the aisle. At first, it seemed to be a man, tall, broad-shouldered, but the shape was wrong. Its limbs moved with a slow, jerking motion, as if the body wasn't used to being walked in. The head tilted too far to one side, the shadow of its face stretching unnaturally in the candlelight. Elias stumbled back toward the altar, his mind clawing for prayers, for anything that might hold it back. But his thoughts were scattered, colliding with each other in panic. This was no longer a test of faith. This was survival. The figure stopped just short of the altar, its head tilting further still until there was an audible crack of bone. Then it spoke, or tried to. The sound was broken, wet, and wrong, but the words were clear enough to tear through him. It's time. Elias's body moved before his mind could catch up. He grabbed the iron cross from the wall and stepped forward, holding it out like a shield. The thing didn't retreat. Instead, it moved closer, the smell of rot and damp earth rolling off in waves. The hum from the floor grew louder, shaking the boards beneath their feet. What happened next was fast, violent, and almost dreamlike. The figure lunged, and Elias swung the cross with all his strength. The blow connected with a sickening crack, but instead of falling, the thing pushed him back, pinning him against the altar. His vision blurred. The cross slipped from his grasp. In the flicker of the candlelight, he saw its eyes, black, bottomless, and endless, as he felt its hand on his chest, cold and heavy. His breath caught, his heart slamming against his ribs. In that instant, every instinct told him he wasn't just going to die. He was going to be taken. And then, something inside him snapped. His fear gave way to a sudden, desperate rage. He grabbed the nearest object, the heavy brass candlestick, and drove it forward with everything he had. There was a sound, not quite a scream, not quite human, that filled every inch of the church. The figures staggered back, and the boards beneath them buckled with a sharp crack. A dark, wet shadow spread outward across the floor, and the hum became a roar. Elias tried to run, but his foot caught on the hem of his cast. Uck! He hit the ground hard, his head striking the stone. The world tilted. When his vision cleared, the figure was gone, swallowed into the dark hole that had opened in the floor. But the sound, low, furious, still echoed from below. Elias dragged himself to his knees, clutching the altar for balance. His breath was ragged, his skin slick with sweat. He didn't know if he'd stopped it or only freed it. The aftermath was chaos. The candle had gone out, leaving only moonlight streaming through the cracked shutters. The air was thick with the stench of soil and decay. Elias moved through the church like a man in a fever dream, grabbing the diary, shoving it into his coat pocket. His hands shook so badly he could barely lock the doors. Outside, the town still slept, unaware of what had happened. Elias stood on the steps, his chest heaving, his mind racing. He wanted to believe it was over. But as he looked back at the church, at the faint, shifting shadow that still seemed to move behind the glass, he knew better. That was when he made the final entry in his diary. No explanations, no details, just 2 words, written with a trembling hand and a smear of dirt across the page. Its backed up morning. The church stood locked and silent, the heavy iron chains glinting dully in the pale light. No mass was held that day. The notice on the door, written in Father Elias's uneven hand, simply read, "Closed until further notice." It did nothing to stop the questions that first people whispered about illness. Perhaps the priest had fallen sick. But when Mrs. Caro, who had worked alongside him for over a decade, was seen leaving the rectory in tears, the rumors shifted. By midday, someone claimed to have seen damage inside. Broken boards, deep scratches in the altar rail. Someone else swore they'd heard shouting in the middle of the night. Father Elias didn't speak to anyone. He avoided the bakery, the market, and even the streets. When he did leave the rectory, it was only after dark, his coat pulled tight, his head down. Those who caught a glimpse said he looked thinner, older, like the life had been drained from him in a matter of days. Inside the rectory, the aftermath weighed heavily on him. The diary sat on the desk, its final entry staring back at him. He read it over and over, as though the words might change if he looked long enough. But they didn't. The memory of that night came in fragments. The hum from below, the cold grip on his chest, the black eyes. His mind tried to twist them into something explainable, but nothing fit. The guilt came in waves. He thought of the parishioners he'd kept in the dark, the warnings he'd given only in half phrases. He should have done more. He should have told someone everything. And yet, another part of him believed it wouldn't have mattered, that no one would have believed him until it was too late. The town's perception of him began to shift. Once seen as a pillar of calm, he was now the subject of uneasy stares and hushed speculation. Some pitied him, thinking he'd suffered some kind of breakdown. Others distrusted him, wondering if he'd done something to bring whatever had happened upon himself. And though no official investigation was launched, the church preferred to keep its troubles quiet. Whispers of calling and the bishop grew louder. Mrs. Caro avoided speaking about what she'd seen that night when she went to check on him. But she carried the image with her. Elias sitting in the dark, his clothes damp with sweat, his hands streaked with soil. He hadn't looked at her when she asked what was wrong. He'd only said, "It's not over," in a voice that didn't sound like his own. For the townspeople, the unease settled into daily life like a cold draft no one could block out. The harvest festival went on, but the laughter felt forced. Fewer people lingered in the streets after sunset. A group of children dared each other to knock on the church door, but none of them could bring themselves to do it. Privately, some people began connecting dots they'd ignored before. The strange noises, the sudden repairs, the way Father Elias had seemed to watch the shadows more than the people in front of him. The story of the 2 boys hearing the knocks spread quickly, gaining details that may or may not have been true. Low voices, whispers from beneath the floor, a shadow moving across the nave. In the weeks that followed, Elias stopped keeping regular hours. Some nights, a faint light could be seen moving in the church long after midnight, though no one saw him go inside. When asked about it, he claimed he hadn't been there. The emotional toll spread beyond him. Mrs. Carroll music at Sunday service, now held in the town hall, lost its warmth. The altar boys kept their distance, uneasy around their priest. Parents who once trusted him implicitly now hesitated before letting their children near the rectory. The air between him and the community had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. The bishop eventually sent a letter asking for an explanation for the church's closure. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he sat in his study night after night, staring at the diary, waiting. For what? He couldn't say. The silence between the walls felt different now. Not empty, but expectant. He told himself he was ready if it came back. But the truth was, he didn't know if he had the strength for another night like that one. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind through the shutters, made his chest tighten. The memory of that cold, unyielding grip was never far from his mind. And though no one else in Black Hollow knew exactly what had happened inside the church that night, the sense of something unfinished hung heavy over them all. Some nights, when the wind moved just right, a low hum seemed to drift through the streets, barely loud enough to hear. Most ignored it, but those who remembered the old well, the stories, and the priest's warnings, they listened. And they didn't answer. Winter settled over Black Hollow like a heavy blanket, muting colors and sounds until the whole town seemed to breathe in whispers. The church remained locked, its iron gates crusted with frost, the spire a sharp silhouette against the pale sky. Weeks had passed since that night, yet the sense of unfinished business lingered. No legal action was ever taken. There was no trial, no charges, no official explanation to put in the town's records. What had happened inside the church lived only in the mind of Father Elias, and perhaps in the unspoken fears of those who had felt something shift that night. Elias never returned to his old duties. The bishop's inquiries grew more pointed, but the priest's replies, when he sent them at all, were brief and evasive. He avoided any suggestion of reopening the church, claiming repairs were ongoing, though no workmen were ever seen at the site. His parishioners drifted away to neighboring towns, their faith in him eroded not by proof of wrongdoing, but by the silence he wrapped around himself like armor. In a small community like Black Hollow, reputation is currency, and Elias's was spent. Some pitied him, seeing in his drawn face the W. Ada something no man should carry alone. Others whispered that he had brought it on himself, that the thing which came into the church was summoned, not stumbled upon. In the absence of truth, people built their own, and each version of the story reflected their fears more than the facts. Mrs. Caro retired quietly from her duties, her music never again heard in the church or the town hall. She avoided questions, but her distance spoke loudly. The altar boys, now older, carried the memory of those days in subtle ways. Flinches at sudden noises, reluctance to walk past the churchyard. For them, it was not only a story, but something lived and felt, something that had left its mark. The crime, if that was what it could be called, had no legal label. It left no body to mourn, no missing person to search for. And yet, it had taken something. Trust, for one. The easy confidence that people had in their priest, in their church, in the invisible boundary between the safety of the known and the danger of the unknown. That was gone. And once gone, such things are not easily rebuilt. Black Hollow learned to live with the unease. The Harvest Festival returned the next year, though fewer stalls were filled. The bakery still opened each morning, but the laughter inside was quieter. The old well remained sealed. The chains on the church doors began to rust, and the nights seemed just a little longer than they had before. In his final months in town, Elias moved through the streets like a ghost of himself. His shoulders were always hunched, his eyes scanning doorways, alleyways, rooftops. Not in fear, exactly, but in vigilance. He kept the diary close, the pages worn soft at the edges. Sometimes he added a note, but more often he just read, turning to that last entry again and again. It's back. The words had been written in warning, but by then, he seemed to read them as a reminder, a truth that lived beneath the surface of things. Eventually, he left without farewell. No one saw him pack. No one heard the creak of wheels in the night. One morning, the rectory was simply empty. On the desk sat the key to the church, a small stack of letters tied with twine, and the diary, its last page blank. The broader impact of what happened in Black Hollow was harder to measure. It didn't change laws or inspire headlines beyond the county, but it left its mark in quieter ways. People became more guarded, more private. They trusted a little less. Parents told their children not just to stay away from the well, but to come inside before dusk, just in case. The older generation and began speaking more openly about the strange stories they'd once kept to themselves, as if acknowledging them might somehow keep worse things away. There was a moral weight to it all, though no one would name it out loud. Some saw Elias as a man who had failed in his duty to protect his flock, others as a man who had faced something no one else would dare. The truth, if there was a single one, sat somewhere between those views. Power had shifted that night, away from the priest, away from the church, and perhaps into the hands of something no one fully understood. If there was justice, it was not the kind written into law. It was a quieter reckoning, the isolation of the man at the center of it all, the erosion of his place in the town, the slow fading of his name from conversations. And yet, in that fading, a question remained, whether he had sacrificed himself to hold something back, or whether his silence had doomed them all to in the end. The church stood empty, its doors locked, its altar untouched. Seasons passed, and ivy began to creep up the stone walls. Children grew into adults who told stories about the night the priest closed the church and never opened it again. They told it in whispers, often with a shiver, but always with a glance toward the spire, as though to check it still stood. And somewhere, far from Black Hollow, perhaps in a small room with a single candle, Father Elias might have been writing again. Another page, another warning. Because if his last words in that diary were true, if it had come back once, there was no reason to believe it wouldn't again. The real weight of the story was not in the crime itself, but in what it revealed about people. How quickly faith can turn to doubt. How fear can change the way neighbors look at each other. How morality bends under the strain of survival. And how, when faced with something that shakes the foundations of what we believe to be true, the most human instinct is not always to fight, but to close the doors, lock them tight, and hope the thing outside never finds a way in.